Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that the global automotive industry was nearly brought to a grinding halt, not by a war or an oil crisis, but by a tiny 2-cent chip you've never heard of? How could a single, obscure Dutch company become the flashpoint in a geopolitical showdown between the world's greatest superpowers? To really understand what happened, we first have to look at the company at the center of it all. Nexperia is a name that's probably unfamiliar to most consumers, operating as a critical yet largely invisible cog in the global industrial machine. This Dutch based semiconductor company was established in the year 2017, having been spun off from its parent, NXP Semiconductors. While it may not command the headlines of high profile chip designers like NVIDIA or Intel, Nexperia's role in the foundational electronics that power modern life is arguably just as profound. Headquartered in the Netherlands, the company inherited a long legacy of European semiconductor manufacturing, specializing in a segment of the market that is often overlooked but utterly indispensable. Its identity is not one of cutting edge, high performance computing, but rather of reliability, volume, and foundational necessity. This focus on the building blocks of electronics would ultimately place it at the epicenter of a major geopolitical conflict. Now, the core of Nexperia's business is what the industry refers to as the standard products segment. This category includes a vast array of essential components, primarily transistors, MOSFETs, metal oxide semiconductor field effect transistors, and diodes. These are not the complex brains of a computer, but rather the critical switches, amplifiers, and regulators that manage power and electrical signals. Without them, no complex electronic system can function. Nexperia's business model is built on an economy of scale that is difficult to comprehend. The company manufactures and sells more than 100 billion of these units every single year. This staggering volume underscores the ubiquitous nature of its products. However, the cost of each individual component is minuscule, often measured in mere cents. This high volume, low cost strategy is remarkably successful, generating approximately $2 billion in annual revenue. This unique market position, being a supplier of low cost, simple, yet non negotiable components, makes Nexperia a linchpin in many supply chains. It is far easier for a company to find an alternative supplier for a $10 component than it is to replace a 2-cent component that is required by the billion. And the single most important market for these standard products is the global automotive industry. A modern vehicle is a complex electronic ecosystem on wheels, a far cry from the mechanical machines of decades past. Dozens of small motors, sensors, and computer modules operate everything from the engine timing to the infotainment system. Nexperia's components are essential for controlling these systems. They are responsible for managing the power flowing to internal and external lights, activating the motors that control power windows and dashboard signals, and regulating the myriad of other small electronic tasks that drivers take for granted. It is estimated that a single car rolling off the assembly line today can contain hundreds of individual Nexperia components. This deep integration means that the automotive industry is not just a customer of Nexperia, it is fundamentally dependent on it. This dependency, built on a foundation of cheap and abundant chips, proved to be a critical vulnerability that neither the industry nor Western governments had fully appreciated until it was too late. So this sets the stage for the acquisition that changed everything. In the year 2018, just 1 year after its formation as an independent entity, Nexperia underwent a profound change in its ownership. Wingtech, a technology company based in China and partially owned by the Chinese state, acquired a controlling 80% stake in the Dutch chipmaker. The deal was valued at approximately $4 billion. This acquisition immediately raised eyebrows in Western capitals, representing a significant move by a Chinese entity to gain control of a key European semiconductor asset. The integration was not merely financial. Following the acquisition, Wingtech's chairman, Zhang Shuizheng, also assumed the role of chief executive officer of Nexperia. This move gave Wingtech direct operational control over the Dutch company, consolidating its influence and further blurring the lines between Nexperia's European origins and its new Chinese ownership. This dual role of chairman and CEO placed a single Chinese national with deep ties to his home government at the helm of a company that supplied critical components to the entirety of Europe's auto industry. But the strategic logic of this acquisition wasn't immediately clear to many outside observers, which only fueled suspicions. You see, Wingtech's primary business was not in semiconductor manufacturing, but in contract smartphone assembly. It was an original design manufacturer, ODM, that built devices for other brands, most notably producing phones like the T-Mobile Revel 7 Pro. Wingtech was a major player in this field, but it was fundamentally an assembler, not a chip maker. Furthermore, Wingtech's ownership structure was a significant point of concern for Western security analysts. The company was 30% owned by the Chinese government. In the context of China's state-led industrial policy, this was not seen as a passive investment. It raised immediate and widespread assumptions of significant state influence, suggesting that Wingtech's corporate decisions were likely aligned with or directly influenced by the strategic goals of Beijing. The idea that a company with such close government ties was now in control of a vital European semiconductor firm was deeply unsettling to policymakers in both Europe and the United States. The United States government, in particular, viewed the acquisition with overt suspicion. Two primary concerns were repeatedly raised. The first was the significant strategic mismatch. Analysts questioned why a smartphone assembler like Wingtech would suddenly pivot to acquire a company that produced low-end legacy node chips almost exclusively for the automotive and industrial sectors. The synergies were not obvious. Wingtech's phones did not use the high-power MOSFETs that Nexperia specialized in. This lack of a clear commercial motive led directly to the second, more alarming concern, a hidden geopolitical motive. U.S. officials increasingly voiced the suspicion that the Nexperia acquisition was not a standalone business deal, but rather a calculated move in China's alleged master plan. This plan, as perceived by Washington, was to methodically acquire sensitive technology, gain control of key nodes in the global supply chain, and ultimately monopolize the production of certain essential semiconductors. By controlling the supply of these dumb but necessary chips, China could potentially gain enormous economic and political leverage capable of holding Western industries hostage. Nexperia, with its deep entrenchment in the auto industry, was seen as a perfect target for such a strategy. Now, in a bizarre and ironic subplot to this whole geopolitical drama, Wingtech found itself tangentially connected to the very U.S. administration that would later target it. In June of 2025, the Trump Organization, the family business of the sitting president, launched a new venture called Trump Mobile. This company was established as a mobile virtual network operator, or MVNO, meaning it did not own its own cellular infrastructure, but instead leased bandwidth from existing carriers. The flagship product of Trump Mobile was a smartphone called the T1. The phone was heavily marketed with a designed in America claim, appealing to a sense of patriotism. However, independent analysis of the phone's technical specifications quickly cast serious doubt on this claim. The T1 specs its memory, screen resolution, and most notably, its inclusion of a 3.5 millimeter headphone jack, a feature largely abandoned by modern smartphone designers, were found to be nearly identical to those of the T-Mobile Revel 7 Pro. The Revel 7 Pro, a budget smartphone, was known to be manufactured by none other than Wingtech. This analysis led to the widespread conclusion that the T1 phone was almost certainly a rebranded Revel 7 Pro. The irony was stark. The Trump Organization was apparently preparing to sell a $500 phone marketed as an American designed product that was in reality a reskinned $128 budget phone manufactured by the exact Chinese state linked company that the Trump administration's own Commerce Department was actively investigating as a national security threat. This strange episode highlighted the complex and often contradictory nature of global commerce and politics. This brings us to the Western intervention and the eventual expropriation. The simmering concerns over Wingtech's ownership of Nexperia began to boil over as the U.S. government initiated a direct and sustained pressure campaign. As early as June of 2025, officials from the Trump administration made direct contact with their counterparts in the Dutch government. They explicitly highlighted their national security concerns regarding Wingtech and its CEO, Zhang Shuizheng, effectively demanding that the Netherlands take action. The primary tool of this pressure campaign was the U.S. Commerce Department's entity list, a notorious blacklist that bars foreign companies from accessing U.S. technology and markets. In the year 2024, Wingtech itself was added to this list. The U.S. government justified this by stating that Wingtech was believed to be involved in efforts to acquire sensitive semiconductor capabilities on behalf of the Chinese military-industrial complex. The decisive blow came on September 29, 2025. On that day, the U.S. Commerce Department announced a major expansion of its entity list policy going forward. All majority-owned subsidiaries of companies already on the list would be automatically added as well. This new rule was a direct, unambiguous threat aimed squarely at Nexperia. As a majority-owned subsidiary of Wingtech, Nexperia's inclusion on the entity list was now imminent. This was a potential death sentence for the company. Being blacklisted would bar Nexperia from purchasing essential U.S.-made semiconductor manufacturing equipment and software, and it would effectively lock it out of the critical U.S. market, a move that could trigger financial collapse and bankruptcy. The U.S. had successfully placed the Dutch government in an impossible position. So, caught between the aggressive demands of its most powerful ally, the United States, and the prospect of a critical domestic company failing, the Dutch government chose a drastic and unprecedented path. In early October of 2025, the Dutch government moved to seize control of Nexperia. The government's initial demands were for Nexperia to immediately install a new government approved supervisory board, effectively stripping Wingtech of its operational control. When Nexperia refused to comply with this demand, the Dutch government escalated. On October 7th, it formally forced the resignation of CEO Zhang Shuizheng, removing Wingtech's direct leader from power. To justify this extreme intervention, the Dutch government resurrected an obscure Cold War era law, the Goods Availability Act of 1952. This law, passed during a time of heightened fears of Soviet invasion, granted the state sweeping powers to seize private property and companies to ensure the availability of essential consumer goods during a national crisis. In a move that shocked legal and corporate observers, the Dutch government invoked this act for the very first time in its nearly 75-year history. The stated rationale was twofold. First, that Wingtech was mismanaging Nexperia and draining its financial resources, and second, that this mismanagement threatened to disrupt the supply of essential chips to the European auto industry. This was, by all accounts, a preemptive action. There was no public evidence that Wingtech was actively planning to cut off supply, only the theoretical possibility that it could. The action itself was a de facto expropriation of the company without compensation. The Dutch government immediately froze all of Wingtech's shares, placing them under the control of a government-appointed custodian. Furthermore, it issued an order taking direct operational control of Nexperia, prohibiting the company from relocating any assets, firing existing executives, or making any significant decisions without explicit permission from the state. In a single stroke, the Netherlands had seized a $4 billion Chinese-owned asset, an act that would trigger an immediate and devastating geopolitical response. This action immediately led to Chinese retaliation and the global supply chain crisis that followed. The problem was the Dutch government's bold maneuver overlooked a fatal flaw in Nexperia's operational structure. While the company's headquarters and its high-tech wafer fabrication facilities were safely located in Europe, specifically in Germany and the United Kingdom, the manufacturing process did not end there. These fabrication plants produced the raw wafers, which are complex silicon disks containing thousands of chips. But these wafers are not finished products. To be turned into usable components, the wafers must be shipped to specialized facilities for assembly and testing. This process involves cutting the wafers into individual chips, bonding them into protective casings, and testing them for quality. Nexperia's three main assembly and testing facilities were located in China, Malaysia, and the Philippines. This geographical split created the choke point. The Nexperia assembly facility in China was, by an enormous margin, the largest and most important of the three. It was responsible for processing and finishing over 70% of Nexperia's total global output. This meant that while the Netherlands had seized the company's brain in Europe, China retained physical control over its hands, the critical final stage production responsible for the vast majority of its revenue. This gave Beijing all the leverage it needed. Beijing's retaliation was not diplomatic, it was swift, precise, and crippling. Almost immediately after the Dutch government announced the seizure, the Chinese government imposed a full export ban on all finished products from the Nexperia factory in China. In parallel, reports emerged that the Chinese government had instructed the management of the Chinese factory to stop responding to communications from the new government appointed leadership in the Netherlands. China had effectively severed Nexperia's Chinese operations from its Dutch headquarters. The flow of chips to the global market stopped overnight. The very scenario the Dutch government claimed to be preventing a cutoff of essential chips was now a reality, directly triggered by the Dutch government's own actions. The consequences of this were immediate and catastrophic, leading to a global automotive shutdown. Billions of finished transistors, MOSFETs, and diodes began piling up in Chinese warehouses, unable to be shipped to customers in Europe, America, or the rest of Asia. Automakers who typically operate on lean, just in time inventory systems began to panic. By late October of 2025, the situation had escalated from a corporate dispute to a full blown global supply chain crisis. On October 29th, the European Automobile Manufacturers Association, which includes industry giants like Volkswagen, BMW, and Stellantis, issued a desperate public warning. Its members, they announced, were days away from complete production stoppages as their stockpiles of Nexperia components had been exhausted. The crisis was not contained to Europe. The shutdown of over 70% of Nexperia's supply had global reach. Major automotive plants in Japan, Mexico, and Brazil all reported that they were being forced to idle production lines. In the United States, facilities in Alabama, a major hub for auto manufacturing, were also forced to halt or slow down production. The interconnectedness of the industry meant that a single factory in China, held hostage by a political dispute, could bring the entire global automotive sector to its knees. And the central irony of this entire debacle was just impossible to miss. The Dutch government, under pressure from the United States, had taken the extreme step of expropriating a foreign owned company. Its stated justification was to prevent a potential supply chain disruption that could harm its auto industry. Yet, this very action instantly triggered that exact disruption, creating a far more severe and immediate crisis than the theoretical one they had claimed to be avoiding. The move was revealed as a stunning strategic miscalculation. It was based on the flawed assumption that owning the Dutch headquarters equated to controlling the company. The Dutch government had failed to recognize, or had willfully ignored, that the true power lay with whoever controlled the physical assembly plants. China already had this power. The seizure did not secure the supply chain, it merely gave Beijing a reason to weaponize it. So, how did this all get resolved? It ended in what can only be described as a geopolitical capitulation. The crisis, which was now threatening to crater the global economy, was resolved not in The Hague or Brussels, but as a high level bargain between the two superpowers at the heart of the conflict. On October 29th, 2025, the very same day the European automakers issued their dire warning, US President Donald Trump met with Chinese President Xi Jinping in South Korea for a summit ostensibly focused on broader trade issues. The Nexperia crisis had become such a massive point of leverage that it was now a centerpiece of these top level negotiations. A deal was struck. The United States agreed to a series of major concessions. First, it would significantly reduce tariffs on a range of Chinese imports. Second, and most critically for this dispute, the U.S. agreed to halt the expansion of its entity list policy for at least 1 year. This meant the subsidiary rule that had threatened Nexperia with bankruptcy was now off the table. In exchange, China also offered concessions. It agreed to relax its own recently imposed export controls on rare earth elements, which are vital for U.S. defense and technology sectors. And, crucially, Beijing agreed to immediately end the export ban on Nexperia chips. The global auto industry could breathe again, but the resolution made it clear Nexperia had been a pawn in a much larger game, and the U.S. had just traded its allies' primary security concern for its own economic and strategic interests. And for the Dutch government, the resolution was a quiet and humiliating capitulation. Having triggered a global crisis, angered its entire industrial base, and been ultimately bypassed in the final negotiations, it was left with no choice but to reverse course. Facing immense and overwhelming pressure from its own automakers, the Dutch government, which just weeks earlier had acted with such force, signaled that it was ready to drop or revoke its emergency control over Nexperia. This reversal, they stated, was conditional on China resuming the chip supply, as companies like Honda soon confirmed that their shipments of Nexperia components from China had indeed resumed. The Dutch government quietly prepared to relinquish its control. The crisis it had started was over, but the damage was done. But even as the ships began to move and the assembly lines restarted, the story wasn't truly over. The resolution was less of a conclusion and more of an uncomfortable, indefinite pause. The legal and corporate structure of Nexperia was left shattered. Wingtech was still the owner on paper, but its asset had been publicly targeted, and its operational control remained in a state of limbo, caught between a resentful Dutch government and a triumphant Beijing. The financial costs were staggering. Even a shutdown of just a few weeks had cost the global auto industry billions of dollars in lost production and revenue. This wasn't a no harm, no foul situation. It left deep and permanent scars. Think about the company itself, Nexperia, caught in the crossfire. Its entire business model was built on a reputation for boring reliability, for being the standard product supplier that always delivered. That reputation was now compromised. How could a car manufacturer in Germany or the US ever fully trust that this supply chain wouldn't be weaponized again? This created an internal crisis as well. The European employees in the Netherlands, Germany, and the UK were now working for a company that was an international political football. The Dutch CFO, who had been installed as CEO, was in an impossible position, trying to manage a company whose own government had just attacked it and whose majority owner was now operating with the full backing of an emboldened Chinese state. This leads to the most critical point. The West's original objective to separate Nexperia from Chinese control had not just failed, it had backfired spectacularly. The Dutch action, intended to assert sovereignty, had instead proven that China was the company's ultimate protector and arbiter. The US, having instigated the fight, looked like an unreliable partner who had abandoned the field mid battle in exchange for concessions on tariffs and rare earths. It had left its Dutch allies to manage the mess they had helped create. When we look back at this, the broader implications are really what matter. The Nexperia saga serves as a stark and definitive case study of how semiconductors have transitioned from mere commercial products to a central battleground for modern geopolitics. The dispute was never truly about corporate mismanagement. It was a proxy clash between the world's two largest economies. It vividly demonstrated the far reaching and often unintended ripple effects of the United States' broader tech containment strategy against Beijing. By pressuring its ally to act, the US inadvertently exposed the vulnerabilities of its own partners, forcing a crisis that ultimately required the US to concede on other unrelated trade issues. It proved that in the 21st century, control over chip supply chains is tantamount to control over the global economy. Beyond just the political maneuvering, this incident was a brutal wake up call about the fragility of our global supply chains. It highlighted a specific and critical vulnerability. The European continent's core auto industry, a pillar of its economic strength, was fundamentally dependent on the final assembly of low cost components in a single country, China. This wasn't just theoretical. In the months and years that followed, this very incident was cited directly in the halls of Brussels to justify the European Chips Act. The goal became strategic autonomy, a powerful new push to onshore critical manufacturing from wafer fab all the way to assembly and testing to ensure that a foreign power could never again hold the continent's industrial heart hostage. Billions of euros were pledged for new foundries, a direct policy line drawn from the Nexperia crisis. For multinational corporations, this event supercharged a strategic shift that was already underway. The China plus one doctrine. The idea was no longer to just find the cheapest place to manufacture, but to build redundancy. The Nexperia crisis proved that relying on a single country, especially a geopolitical rival for over 70% of a critical component, was not a cost saving measure, but an existential risk. Companies, particularly in automotive and electronics, began aggressively diversifying their final assembly operations, looking to new locations like Vietnam, India, and Mexico as essential buffers against future shocks. Ultimately, the Nexperia affair signaled a significant shift in global power dynamics. China, often seen as being on the receiving end of Western trade actions, demonstrated its willingness and potent ability to use its dominant position in manufacturing and assembly as a powerful retaliatory weapon. Its response was not just defensive, it was offensive, precise, and devastatingly effective. China had, in effect, run a wildly successful test case. It demonstrated to the world and to itself exactly how to counter Western sanctions. It didn't need to respond militarily, it simply had to identify a critical, low cost, high volume component that the West was addicted to and then squeeze. This playbook could be run again with other materials, pharmaceutical precursors, specific minerals, or other electronic components. Conversely, the Western action initiated by the US and executed by the Netherlands was exposed as ineffective, strategically clumsy, and poorly calculated. It damaged the West's credibility, showing that it could be forced to back down when faced with the real world economic consequences of its own policies. While the immediate crisis was resolved, the status of Nexperia itself remains in question, a symbol of the unresolved tensions. The trust between China and Europe in the critical technology sector has been deeply and perhaps permanently damaged. The Nexperia